The blood on the throne room floor was hers, and the king would not let them clean it up. That's where this story ends. Let's go back to where it begins, with a knife she wasn't supposed to be holding, and a man who rose from a throne for a woman he'd never met. 3 days before the blood, there was only the gold chain. It was thin. That's the detail nobody expected. Not rope, not iron. Just a chain you could snap with 2 fingers if you knew where to pull. It crossed Merritt's collarbone and disappeared into the sleeve of a borrowed gray dress, and at the end of it was a man named Oswin Drell, an envoy with a missing left earlobe, bitten off, he liked to say, by a war dog that didn't survive the telling, and an itch to be done with his errand before sundown. Behind him stretched the rest of the tribute, grain sacks stacked like bodies, 6 casks of black wine, a boy carrying a hawk with its eyes sewn shut for travel, the bird stiff with a fury that had nowhere to go. And last, almost an afterthought on the ledger, a line that read, "One woman of the Ashvale line for the king's use." The hall of Castle Ravensguard was built to make conquered men feel small. 60 feet of black stone ceiling, banners the color of dried blood, and on the dais, on a throne carved from a single trunk of war oak. So old, the bark still showed at the base, sat Gareth. He had not stood for the grain. He had not stood for the wine. He did not so much as lift his chin for the hawk. Merritt kept her eyes on the floor, the way her mother taught her, a bowed neckbreak slower, and listened to her own name read out like a tax. "Ashvale," the steward said, voice flat as a ledger entry. "Final tribute." The chain went taut. Oswin tugged it the way you'd tug a dog that was thinking about sitting down in the road, and Merritt took the last 3 steps onto the dais floor with her chin low and her pulse loud enough to drown the hall. She had one scar nobody else in this story will have. A thin white line through her left eyebrow, shaped like a fishhook. From the winter she was 9, and the roof of her family's smokehouse came down in an ice storm. She'd touch it without knowing she was doing it. She touched it now, and the king of Ravensguard rose from his throne, not a courtesy rise, not the half-lift men do for a pretty face. He came up off that war oak seat the way a man comes up off the ground after a hard fall, fast, involuntary, both hands finding the armrests first like he needed something solid to push against. The hall went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has just recalculated who holds the power. Oswin Drell's mouth opened, closed. He had meant the chain as the cruelest line in the whole tribute. A woman handed over like livestock. The conquered territory's last insult dressed up as a gift. "Here, Alpha King, since you've taken everything else, take this too and choke on it." He had rehearsed the sneer he'd wear when the king barely glanced at her. He had not rehearsed for this. Gareth came down the dais steps, 3 of them, then 4, his boots loud on stone that had gone that silent. He stopped 2 feet from Merritt, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and steel oil and something underneath that her body recognized before her mind did, something that made the fine hair on her arms lift like a held breath. He didn't reach for the chain first. He looked at her face. "Who gave the order," Gareth said, "to put a tribute on a leash?" It wasn't a question. Oswin's missing earlobe went red at the edge, the only place left on him that could. "It's tradition, my lord. The Ashvale line yields." I asked who. Merritt, who had decided 3 days ago in a cold cart that she would say nothing in this hall, that silence was the only currency she had left to spend, heard her own voice come out instead. "He did," she said, and tipped her chin at Oswin. He thought it would be funny. The hall didn't breathe. Oswin's hand twitched toward the hilt at his hip, an old habit, useless here, surrounded, and Gareth's head turned toward him slow enough to be its own kind of violence. "Take the chain off her," Gareth said. "Then leave my hall before I decide it was funny too. Here is what you need to understand about Merritt Ashvale, because the rest of this won't make sense otherwise. She had buried her mother 11 months ago, lost the family smokehouse to the Crown's grain levy 4 months after that. and walked into this castle already grieving everything a person can grieve before they're 23. She had nothing left to lose, which made her either the bravest woman in that hall or the only one with nothing left to protect. She would find out which before the week was out. So would he. The chain came off her wrist with a sound like a coin dropped on stone. Oswandrell bowed so low, it looked like an apology and meant none of it, and backed out of the hall with his missing earlobe still burning, already composing the version of this story he'd tell that didn't include him losing. Gareth didn't watch him go. He was still looking at Merritt, the way you look at a door you've walked past 100 times and only just noticed was unlocked. "You have a name," he said. "Merritt. You have a tongue too, apparently. It's gotten me in less trouble than you'd think." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. He had a low, level voice that didn't rise even when the words underneath it had teeth, and one detail that belonged to him alone among every man in that hall. A long white scar that ran from his left temple down through his eyebrow and stopped just shy of his eye, old enough that it had gone the color of bone. A claw mark, people said, though no one said whose claws, and no one in that castle had ever found the nerve to ask him. "You're not what was promised on the ledger," he said. "What was promised? A gift." He turned, started back up the dais steps, and something in the line of his shoulders told her the audience was over even before he spoke again. "Get her a room with a working lock," he said to the steward, not looking back. "One she holds the key to. Not me." It should have felt like mercy. It felt, instead, like the first move in a game she hadn't agreed to play. The room they gave her had a narrow window facing the eastern wall, and a hearth that smoked when the wind came from the north. And that first night, lying in a bed too soft for a body that had slept on cartboards. For 3 days, Merritt lay awake doing the only thing she had energy left for, turning the moment over and over like a coin, looking for the trick in it. A king did not rise for tribute. Everyone in the territories knew that. It was the first lesson their mothers taught them about Ravensguard, the way you teach a child not to put their hand in fire. The king receives. The king does not stand. He had stood for her. She didn't know yet that the answer to that question would nearly get her killed twice before the week was through. Once by a man who hated her, and once by a man who loved her, and that she would survive both, and that surviving wasn't going to be the hard part. The hard part would be staying. The castle had a rhythm to it, and within 2 days, Merritt had learned most of its seams. Which corridors the guards walked twice an hour, which kitchen door led out toward the herb garden, which servants would meet her eyes, and which wouldn't. She'd grown up reading rooms for danger the way other women read for weather, and Ravensguard, for all its black stone and bloody banners, didn't feel like a castle holding a war. It felt like a castle holding its breath. She found out why on the 3rd morning, in the kitchen, from a cook named Ottilie Vance, who had a burned scar shaped like a starfish across the back of her right hand, and no patience left in her body for secrets. 3 tributes have come through this hall in 2 years, Ottilie said, not looking up from the bread she was tearing into smaller and smaller pieces, and 3 times the conquered territories have sent something dressed up pretty to slit a king's throat in his sleep. You're number 4. Don't take it personal if half this castle's waiting to see which kind of gift you turn out to be. And the other half? Ottilie's mouth twitched. The other half watched him stand up off that throne. They're placing wagers. Merritt's face went hot. There's nothing to wager on. Ottilie set the bread down, finally looked at her, a long, assessing look, the kind that costs nothing and reveals everything. He hasn't stood for a woman since his mate died. 5 years. Not for tribute, not for a noblewoman's daughter, not for the 3 girls his own council tried to put in front of him after. You walked in on a chain meant as an insult, and he came off that seat like the floor caught fire. The word mate sat in the air between them, heavier than anything else in the room. "I didn't ask him to," Merritt said. Didn't say you did. Ottilie went back to the bread, just telling you what you walked into. That afternoon, crossing the inner yard with a basket of mending she didn't need to be carrying, except that it gave her hands something to do. Merritt nearly walked straight into Gareth coming the other way. And they both stopped at the same moment, close enough that she could see the scar through his eyebrow catch the light. "You're avoiding the hall," he said. "I'm doing mending. You're avoiding the hall." He said it again, not unkindly, the way you'd correct a child's sums. "Word's gotten around about why I stood. People are watching to see what you do next. What do you want me to do?" He was quiet a moment. Up close, he was taller than the Zaius had let her see, broad through the shoulders in the particular way of men who'd earned it rather than been born to it. And he smelled. There it was again, that thing underneath the wood smoke, of something warm and clean that made her want to lean a half-inch closer, and made her furious at herself for wanting it. "Nothing," he said finally. "That's the trouble. I don't want anything from you. That's never happened to me before, with a tribute. That's supposed to comfort me." "No," a short breath, almost a laugh, gone before it finished. "It's supposed to be honest." He didn't touch her. That was the thing she'd remember later, replaying it, how careful he was, how the half-foot of space between them stayed exactly half a foot, how his hand had come up an inch toward her sleeve and stopped itself. Fingers curling back into his palm like he'd caught himself reaching for a flame. "Your steward gave me a room with a lock," she said. "You gave me the key. Why?" "Because every other tribute who's come through that hall got handed a collar before nightfall." His jaw worked once. "I won't be the kind of king who does that. Not to anyone, especially not." He stopped himself. Especially not what? Nothing. He stepped back, putting real distance between them now, and something in his face closed like a door. "Eat something tonight. You've gone thin since the cart." He was gone before she could ask him what he'd swallowed back, and she stood in the yard with her basket of mending she didn't need, touching the scar through her eyebrow without meaning to, thinking that was the wrong thing to want to know. She wanted to know it anyway. The envoy Oswin Drell did not leave Ravensguard when the king told him to. He left the hall. He found a room in the lower town instead, 3 streets from the castle gate, in a tavern that didn't ask questions of men with coin, and there, on the same night, Merritt lay awake, turning her coin of a question over and over. Oswin sat across a table from a woman whose face he'd known for exactly 4 hours, and whose name he'd been told not to ask. She had pale eyes, nearly colorless, the kind that made men look away first without knowing why, and she'd come to that tavern wrapped in a traveling cloak that hid everything about her shape and a great deal about her intent. "You said the gift would humiliate him," she said. "You said he'd barely look at her." "He stood up," Oswin said, and the words still tasted like ash in his mouth. "He stood up off that throne like she'd lit him on fire. Then the gift failed." "The gift," Oswin said, leaning forward, lowering his voice, though the tavern around them was loud enough to swallow it, "isn't finished yet. You said yourself the chain wasn't the message." The pale-eyed woman didn't answer that directly. She turned her cup in slow circles on the table instead, the way you'd turn a key in a lock you weren't ready to open, and said only, "Then let's hope the king keeps standing up for her. It'll make this easier when the time comes." Neither of them said what this was. The viewer should sit with that a while. So should Merritt, though she didn't yet know there was anything to sit with. The line a king crosses with a tribute, once crossed, doesn't uncross. And Gareth crossed it 4 nights later, in the smallest possible way, which is how the real ones always happen. It rained that night, the kind of rain that finds every gap in old stonework, and Merritt's hearth, the one that smoked when the wind came from the north, chose that exact night to fill her room with smoke instead of heat. She woke coughing, eyes streaming, and stumbled into the corridor in her shift, and a blanket dragged off the bed, more annoyed than afraid. looking for any servant still awake to help her clear it. She found Gareth instead, 3 doors down, in a robe thrown on over bare shoulders, looking like a man who hadn't slept either. "Smoke," she managed, between coughs. "The flu's blocked, I think." He didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. He was past her and into her room before she'd finished it, working the damper with bare hands that didn't flinch from the heat, and within a minute the smoke was drawing properly up the chimney instead of into the room, and the two of them were standing in the gray, thinning haze of it, breathing hard, close enough, now that the half-foot of careful space had collapsed down to almost nothing. "You should have sent for someone," he said. His voice had gone rough. "Smoke or something else. It's the middle of the night. I'm awake at the middle of the night, most nights." He said it like a confession he hadn't meant to make. "Don't send for someone. Send for me." The rain ticked against the window. Somewhere down the corridor a door closed, ordinary and far away, and in the space it left behind Merritt was aware of exactly 3 things. The heat still coming off the hearth, the blanket slipping off one of her shoulders, and the fact that Gareth's eyes had dropped to her bared collarbone, to the place where the chain had sat, and stayed there a half-second too long before he made himself look away. "You're staring," she said, not unkindly. "I know." He didn't apologize for it. "There's a mark there, where the chain sat. I keep noticing it. It'll fade. I know that too." His hand came up, that same aborted reach from the yard, and this time it didn't stop itself in time. 2 fingers, barely touching, traced the air a half-inch above her collarbone without quite landing, close enough that she felt the warmth of his skin without the weight of it. "I keep wanting to put my hand there, cover it, like I could undo the chain having been there at all." "Why?" "Because Oswin Drell looked at you like livestock, and I want to look at you like." He stopped. His hand dropped. "I don't have the word for it yet. That's not very kingly of you." "No." That almost law again, low in his chest. "It isn't. He didn't kiss her. The viewer will want him to, and he doesn't, and that restraint is its own kind of confession." He steps back instead, putting the half-foot of space back between them, like he's rebuilding a wall he'd nearly let fall, and says, "Sleep in the East guest chamber tonight, until your flu's fixed properly," and leaves before either of them can decide what almost just happened. Merritt stood alone in the smoke-thinned room a long while after, one hand pressed flat over her own collarbone where his fingers hadn't quite touched, and thought, "I am in more danger now than I was on that chain, and it has nothing to do with him wanting to hurt me." She didn't know yet how true that was, or how wrong about the shape of it. It's worth slowing down here, because the next part of this story moves fast once it starts, and you should understand exactly what the hall looked like the morning. Everything turned, before it turned. 3 weeks had passed since the tribute. Merritt had stopped sleeping in a room with a smoking flue, and started, without either of them naming it, taking her meals at a small table near the dais instead of with the servants. Not above them, never above them, she made sure of that, but near enough to Gareth's eyeline that conversation had become a habit neither of them examined too closely. She'd learned the names of 40 people in that castle. She'd learned that Gareth read reports by candlelight long past when he should sleep, and that he hummed without noticing when he was concentrating, a low tuneless thing through his teeth, and that the scar through his eyebrow ached in cold weather, and he rubbed it without knowing he was doing it, the same way she touched her own scar without meaning to. She had not learned, because no one had told her, that the pale-eyed woman from the tavern had been seen twice now near the castle's eastern wall, and that Oswin Drell had paid for 3 more nights in the lower town instead of riding home. On the morning of the second tribute hearing, a smaller territory, a lesser lord, routine business, Merritt stood at the edge of the hall the way she'd taken to doing, half in shadow near a pillar. "Watch it, Gareth. Receive grain counts and oath renewals with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who'd learned that ruling well meant ruling slow. She had stopped expecting him to look for her in the crowd. He looked for her anyway, found her by the pillar within the first minute, every time, like his eyes had learned the habit before the rest of him admitted it. It was during the third oath renewal, a minor lord pledging continued tribute, nothing that should have mattered, that Merritt's gaze drifted to a servant near the side door. A new face. She didn't know the name, hadn't learned it in her 40. And there was nothing wrong with that, except that the woman was watching Gareth's hands instead of his face, the way you watch hands when you're calculating distance, instead of listening to words. It was such a small thing, a held breath, nothing more. Merritt almost let it go. She didn't, because 3 weeks of grief and loss had taught her one lesson above all others. Notice the thing that doesn't fit, because the thing that doesn't fit is the thing that costs you. The midpoint of this story breaks something the viewer has believed since the cold open, and it breaks fast, so hold on. You have been led, gently, to believe that the danger in this hall was Oswin Drell's cruelty, or the territory's resentment, or even, in the quiet places of your own suspicion, Merritt herself. A tribute on a chain, a woman handed over with a sneer. The obvious place for a knife to be hidden is in the hand of the one who was insulted, who has every reason to want a king dead. It was never her. The pale-eyed woman from the tavern was not a servant. She had bought her way into the castle's lower staff 11 days earlier, using a name that belonged to a girl who'd died of fever the winter before, and the chain around Merritt's collarbone, the gold one, thin enough to snap with 2 fingers, the one Oswin had paraded as an insult, had never been the message at all. It had been the distraction. A king who stands up from his throne for a woman becomes a king who is watched. Every guard's eyes go to her instead of the room. Every gossip in the castle spends its breath on whether the alpha king has found his mate instead of on who's new among the kitchen staff, who's been seen twice near the eastern wall, who's paid for 3 extra nights in a tavern that doesn't ask questions. Oswin Drell hadn't planted an insult. He'd planted cover. The gift on the gold chain had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had turned every eye in Ravensguard toward Merritt and away from everything else. And the only person in that hall who hadn't been fooled by it, in the end, was the woman it had been used to disguise. Merritt watched the new servant's hand drift, slow and unhurried, toward the inside of her sleeve, where the fabric sat wrong, too heavy on the right side. The kind of wrong that a woman who'd grown up sewing her own dresses with her dead mother's needle would notice. And a castle full of guards trained to watch for swords would not. She didn't think. She moved. Gareth. It came out too loud, cutting clean through a lord's oath mid-sentence, and every head in that hall turned toward her instead of toward the threat, which was the worst possible outcome, and also, in the end, the thing that saved him. Because the pale-eyed woman, seeing every eye in the room swing toward Merritt instead of toward herself, understood in that half-second that her cover was gone, and did the only thing left to a planted blade once it's been seen. She ran for the dace instead of, away from it, the long knife clearing her sleeve in one practiced motion, silver and ugly and entirely real. The hall didn't have time to scream before it had time to act. What you need to understand about the 7 seconds that followed is that nobody in that hall had time to be brave on purpose. There was only what their bodies already knew. A guard near the side door moved first and was too far. The lord mid-oath threw himself flat, which saved no one but himself. Gareth came up off the throne. The second time in this story he's done that, and the viewer should feel the echo of it. But a throne, however close to the floor, is still 3 steps up, and 3 steps is a lifetime when a blade is already in the air. Merritt was closer. She had spent 3 weeks learning the seams of that castle the way she'd once learned to read a winter sky for the storm in it. And her body, grief-thinned and underestimated by everyone in that room, including herself, did the thing it had been quietly training for, without either of them knowing it. She crossed the 4 feet between the pillar and the dais, faster than a woman in a borrowed gray dress, should have been able to move, and put herself between the knife and the King of Ravensguard. The blade caught her along the forearm instead of finding Gareth's throat. A long line, not deep enough to be the end of anything, deep enough to hurt for a month and scar for life. A second mark on her body now, a sister to the fish hook through her eyebrow, this one a straight pale line she'd carry the rest of her days. Blood came fast and hot, and far more of it than the wound warranted, the way small wounds in soft places always bleed worse than they kill. The pale-eyed woman didn't get a second strike. Gareth was on her before the knife could come back around, and what happened next was fast and ugly, and over in under 10 seconds. The King of Ravensguard was not, beneath the patient ruler the hall saw most days. A gentle man, when something he wanted to keep was bleeding on his floor, and when it was finished, the assassin lay still on the black stone, and the silence in that hall was the kind that rings in the ears afterward, louder than the noise that caused it. Gareth turned to Merritt before the body had finished falling. "Let me see." His hands were already on her arm, careful and shaking in a way his voice wasn't. "Let me see. Let me." "It's not deep." Her own voice came out thinner than she meant it to. "I've had worse from a kitchen knife. You stepped in front of me. You were going to be too slow. Merritt." Her name in his mouth had never sounded like that before, cracked open. All the careful distance gone out of it in one stroke. "You stepped in front of a knife for me." Someone had to, she said, and her knees chose that moment to remind her how much blood she'd just lost, and the hall tilted sideways. And the last thing she heard before the floor came up to meet her was Gareth's voice, no longer careful at all, shouting for a healer in a tone that cracked stone. She woke to candlelight and the smell of crushed yarrow, and Gareth in a chair pulled close enough to the bed that his knee was nearly against the frame, holding her bandaged forearm in both his hands like it was the only thing in the room. "You're an idiot," he said, before she'd even finished opening her eyes. "Good morning to you, too. You could have died." "I didn't." "That's not." He stopped, dragged a hand down his face, and she saw in the candlelight that the scar through his eyebrow had gone tight with strain, the way it did in cold weather, except the room wasn't cold. "That's not the point, Merritt. You weren't supposed to be the one in danger. You were supposed to be safe," she finished, "because you decided I was something to protect, not someone who gets to decide that for herself." He went quiet. It was, she would think later, the first time she'd ever seen him caught flat-footed by something that wasn't a blade. "You're right," he said finally, and it cost him something to say it. She could hear that it did. "I did decide that. The day I stood up off that throne, I decided you were mine to keep safe, and I never once asked you if that's what you wanted to be." "It's not." She said it plainly, because she'd had 3 weeks to think about it, and the last hour to nearly bleed out over it, and she wasn't going to waste the clarity that gave her. "I don't want to be kept safe, Gareth. I want to be trusted. There's a difference. And you've been so busy standing between me and every danger in this castle that you haven't noticed I'm the one who saw this one coming." He was quiet a long moment, his thumb moving in a slow, absent line along the edge of her bandage. "I know," he said. "I've known it since the hall went quiet, and every guard in that room turned to look at you instead of the knife, because I'd spent 3 weeks teaching this whole castle that you mattered more than my own safety. I made you the distraction without meaning to. That's on me." "It is," she agreed. There was no comfort in her voice when she said it, and she didn't offer him any. "You did a disappointing thing, Gareth. You made me a target by making me visible, and you never once asked if I wanted that weight. It was the truth, and it sat between them ugly and unresolved, because some moments don't get fixed with an apology. They just get acknowledged and carried forward, and that has to be enough." "What do you want then?" he said. "Tell me, and I'll try to be the kind of king who actually listens." Merritt looked at him a long moment. Really looked. Past the crown he wasn't wearing and the throne he wasn't sitting in. At a man with a scar through his eyebrow and shaking hands, and a habit of humming when he thought no one could hear, and said the only true thing she had left. "I want to know why you stood up," he told her, eventually, but not that night. That night he sat with her until she slept, and was gone by the time she woke, and the not-telling stretched on for 2 more days while the castle buzzed with what everyone now called the thwarted tribute plot. Oswin Drell, when guards finally rode him down in the lower town, gave up the pale-eyed woman's true purpose fast and ugly under questioning Merritt, was glad she wasn't made to witness. The territory hadn't sent Merritt as cover for an insult at all. Not really. Oswin had simply seen, in a tribute list with her name on it, the easiest possible cover for something darker already in motion. A plot 2 years in the planning, paid for by men with older grudges than a single conquered village, who'd wanted Ravensguard's king dead since before Merritt's mother was buried. He groveled when they brought him before Gareth in chains. Actually groveled, knees on the black stone, the missing earlobe burning red one final time, and asked for mercy in a voice that had lost every ounce of the sneer it carried the day he'd led Merritt in on a chain. Gareth didn't kill him. That would have been easy, and this story isn't interested in easy. "You'll work the grain levies you tried to use her to mock," Gareth said, "for the rest of your natural life, under guard, and every season you'll watch the tribute list, read aloud, and know that the woman you put a chain on is the reason you're not in the ground." He paused. "That's worse than dying. You'll live long enough to understand that." Oswin was let out without another word, and whatever became of him after, this story doesn't follow him there. Some threads end exactly where the people in them stops mattering. Merritt found Gareth that evening on the eastern wall, the one the pale-eyed woman had been seen near twice, looking out over land that had been his father's and his father's father's all the way back to whatever first king had decided a throne carved from a single oak trunk was worth fighting for. "You owe me an answer," she said, coming to stand beside him, close enough now that the careful half-foot of space had become, without either of them deciding it, something closer to 4 inches. "I know." So, he was quiet long enough that she thought he might dodge it again, the way he had twice already. Then, "My mate died 5 years ago. Fever, not a blade. There's no enemy to blame for it, which somehow makes it worse. I haven't stood for a woman since. Not tribute, not nobility, not the 3 girls my council paraded in front of me after, hoping grief had an expiry date." His jaw worked. "I told myself I'd stopped feeling the pull of it. The bond sense, the thing that's supposed to tell you when someone matters before your mind's caught up to your body, knowing it. And then a chain came off a cart, meant as an insult, and the second I saw your face I was on my feet before I'd decided to stand. My body knew before I did." He looked at her then, fully, the scar through his eyebrow catching the last of the light. "I didn't rise for a gift, Merritt. I rose because some part of me that I thought died 5 years ago recognized you before I had a single thought about it. That's the truth. That's the whole, ugly, inconvenient truth. That's not nothing," she said quietly. "But it's not enough either. I know. A bond isn't a choice. I won't be chosen because some instinct in your chest decided I was yours before either of us said a word to each other. I know that too." He turned to face her fully now, and there was nothing careful left in the way he looked at her. "So I'm asking, not the bond, me. Will you stay? Not because some part of me recognized you on a chain, but because I'm asking you, with everything I am that isn't instinct, to choose to be here." The wind came up off the eastern land, carrying wood smoke from the lower town and the particular mineral cold of stone that's held heat all day and is starting to lose it. And Merritt thought of her mother, and the smokehouse roof, and a chain thin enough to snap with 2 fingers, and a knife she hadn't been afraid enough to let fly past her. "Ask me again in a year," she said. It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It was. Gareth understood. Watching her face in the dying light, the fishhook scar through her eyebrow and the new pale line down her forearm. 2 marks that hadn't been there the day the chain came off. Exactly the kind of answer a woman gives when she intends to stay long enough to find out, on her own terms, whether staying is worth it. "I can live with that," he said. "Good." A small, real smile, the first he'd seen from her since the bandages. "Because I'm not going anywhere until I've decided for myself." This is where most stories like this one would end. The throne secured, the plot foiled, the envoy groveling in chains, the king and the gift he was given finally standing close enough to call it something. But the truest things in this story were never the ones that got resolved. Months later, long after the bandage on Merritt's forearm had thinned to a clean pale scar she touched without meaning to, the way she touched the fishhook through her eyebrow, a letter arrived at Ravensguard's gate with no seal and no sender's mark. Inside it was a single line, in handwriting nobody in the castle recognized. The territory that sent the chain was not the one that wanted you dead. Gareth burned it before the council saw it. He told Merritt, because by then there was very little he didn't tell her, sitting across from her at the same small table near the dais, where she'd once eaten in careful, watchful silence and now ate without watching anything at all except him. "Do you believe it?" she asked. "I don't know." He turned his cup in a slow circle, the way the pale-eyed woman once had, though neither of them would ever know that detail to be afraid of it. Someone funded Oswin's plan. Someone older than a single insulted village. We never found who. Then it's not finished. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." Merritt looked at him a long moment, not afraid, not the way she'd have been afraid 3 weeks into the chain, watching for the trick in every kindness. Just steady. A woman who'd already survived one knife meant for someone else's throat, and had decided, somewhere in the month since, that she'd rather face the next one standing beside him than safely tucked away behind a lock she held the only key to. "Then we'll find out who," she said, together, and reached across the small table, and for the first time since the chain came off her wrist, she was the one who closed the distance. He let her. He'd learned by then that some things a king doesn't reach for first, some things you wait to be chosen for. Outside the hall, the tribute lists kept coming, the way they always had. Grain, wine, oaths, the ordinary business of conquered land paying its due. But the steward who read them aloud had learned, without ever being told to read the final line a little slower now, a little more carefully, in case some other territory ever again mistook a gift for an insult and sent a woman down that long black hall on a chain. None of them ever did. Maybe word had traveled. Maybe no one wanted to find out twice what happened in that throne room the last time someone tried. The letter's sender was never found. The scar on Merritt's forearm never fully faded, and some nights, long after the candles burned down and the castle went quiet, Gareth still woke with his hand already moving toward the place beside him before his mind had caught up to why. The same instinct that once lifted him off a throne for a stranger on a chain, still working, still ahead of him, still certain of something he was only now, slowly, learning to trust on purpose, instead of by accident. She let him reach for her, in the dark, when no one was watching, to make it mean something it didn't have to mean yet. That was enough. For now it was enough.